Number 17. Meatloaf with tomato glaze and green beans. In 1849, a baker in San Francisco sold flour biscuits for $1 each. $1. Adjusted for today, that is roughly $38 for one biscuit. Men paid it without blinking because the alternative was starving in a muddy ditch 200 miles from the nearest town. Number 17 on this list was so hated that miners rioted over it in 3 separate camps. Number 6 was borrowed from Chinese laborers and ignored for 150 years until modern nutritionists called it genius. And number 2 was a desperate invention that accidentally created one of the most iconic dishes in American food history. These 25 meals were not cooked for pleasure. They were cooked for survival by men who left everything behind to chase gold and discovered that the real fortune was making it through the week alive. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 forgotten foods that miners actually ate chasing a fortune. Number 25. Hardtack and coffee. Before a miner ever touched a gold pan, he packed hardtack into his kit. These bone-dry squares of flour and water, baked until every trace of moisture vanished, were the baseline of survival on the trail to California. They could survive months in a canvas sack without spoiling, which mattered when the journey from Missouri took 5 months overland. Miners soaked them in boiled coffee until they softened enough to chew without cracking a tooth. Some crumbled them into whatever broth or grease was available, turning the tasteless crackers into something vaguely resembling food. A pound of hardtack cost a few cents back east, but by the time supply wagons reached the Sierra Nevada foothills, the same pound might sell for 50 cents or more. The taste was chalky and flat. The texture was punishing. But hardtack delivered around 300 calories per 3-ounce serving, and it did not rot, did not melt, and did not attract animals the way fresh food did. Men cursed it around campfires every night and reached for another piece because there was nothing else. Number 24. Salt pork and beans. This was the default meal of the gold rush, the dish that appeared more often than any other across mining camps from Coloma to Hangtown. Salt pork arrived in barrels packed in brine, cured heavily enough to last the long sea voyage around Cape Horn or the overland crossing through Panama. Miners sliced it thick, fried it until the fat rendered, and tossed dried beans into the same pan. The beans soaked up every bit of pork grease and salt, becoming soft and rich after an hour of simmering over a campfire. A barrel of salt pork cost around $10 in San Francisco in 1850, a small fortune. But it fed a group of men for weeks. The monotony was brutal. Diaries from the era record miners eating salt pork and beans for breakfast, dinner, and supper for stretches of 30 days or more. They complained bitterly. They ate every bite. Because when you are standing waist-deep in freezing river water, swirling a pan for 14 hours, anything hot and salty tastes like salvation. Number 23. Flapjacks. Flour, water, and a scrape of lard fried on a flat rock or a tin plate held over coals. That was a gold rush flapjack. No eggs, no milk, no baking powder unless the miner had thought to carry saleratus, an early form of baking soda that produced a faint chemical lift in the batter. The result was dense, chewy, and bland, more like fried flatbread than anything resembling a modern pancake. But flapjacks were fast. A man could mix batter, fry 3 cakes, and eat them in under 10 minutes before heading to the diggings at dawn. Flour was the most sought-after staple in the camps. In 1849, a 50-pound sack sold for as much as $40 in remote claims, roughly $1,400 in today's money. Miners who ran out of flour ran out of options. Flapjacks were the first thing they made when the supply wagon arrived and the last thing they ate when the sack ran low. Number 22, boiled beans. When salt pork was gone and the bacon was finished and there was nothing left but a sack of dried pintos, miners boiled beans in plain water with salt. That was the entire recipe. No onion, no fat, no seasoning beyond whatever salt remained. The beans simmered for hours over a low fire, sometimes overnight if the miner had the patience, until they softened into a thick, starchy mush. A pound of dried beans cost about 25 cents in most camps, affordable even for men who had not yet struck any color. The dish was filling in the way only plain starch can be, sitting heavy in the stomach and providing slow-burning energy. It was also deeply, thoroughly boring. Miners who ate boiled beans for weeks on end developed a particular kind of resentment toward them, the kind that shows up in letters home as dark humor. One 49er from Ohio wrote to his wife that he had eaten so many beans he expected to sprout a vine from his ears. Number 21, sourdough bread. The sourdough starter was the single most valuable possession a miner could carry that was not a gold pan. A small crock of fermented flour and water, kept alive with daily feedings and guarded against cold, produced bread that no amount of money could buy in the early camps. Miners slept with their starters, tucked inside their bedrolls on freezing nights to keep the wild yeast alive. The bread itself was tangy, chewy, and vastly superior to anything made from flat flour and water. A good starter could last for years, passed from partner to partner, camp to camp, surviving the same journey its owner did. San Francisco became so identified with sourdough that the city's identity is still tied to it. But the tradition began in the mining camps, born from the simple fact that commercial yeast did not exist out there, and wild fermentation was the only option. The Mars who kept their starters alive ate better than everyone else. They knew it, and they guarded those crocks like gold. Number 20, coffee. Calling coffee a food stretches the definition, but for gold rush miners, coffee was not a beverage. It was a survival tool. Men drank it black and brutally strong, brewed by dumping handfuls of ground beans into a pot of boiling water and letting it steep until the liquid turned almost black. Some camps went through a pound of coffee per man per week. At prices ranging from $1 to $5 a pound, in remote diggings, coffee was one of the most expensive staples in the mining camp pantry. But no one cut back. Coffee provided warmth on freezing Sierra mornings, energy through 14-hour days of back-breaking labor, and a ritual that made the wilderness feel slightly less savage. The sound of a coffee pot rattling over a morning fire was the unofficial start of every working day in every camp from Sutter's Mill south to Mariposa. Number 19, bacon. Not the crispy strips of a modern breakfast. Gold Rush bacon was thick-cut, heavily smoked, and cured with enough salt to preserve it for months without refrigeration. Miners fried it in a pan or on a stick over open flame, eating the meat and saving every drop of rendered fat for cooking beans, frying flapjacks, or greasing boots. Bacon grease was a currency of its own in the camps. A pound of bacon cost between 50 cents and $2, depending on the remoteness of the claim, and men measured their wealth partly by how much bacon remained in their supply. The fat content made it the most calorie-dense food available, critical for men burning thousands of calories daily in physical labor. When the bacon ran out, the mood of the camp shifted. Letters and diaries record the arrival of fresh bacon supplies with the same excitement that a gold strike received. First, pattern break. Here is what most people do not understand about Gold Rush food. The prices were insane. Inflation in the mining regions of California between 1848 and 1852 was unlike anything America had seen before or has seen since. An egg cost $1 to $3 in San Francisco in 1849. A single onion sold for $1 or more. A barrel of flour that cost $6 in New York sold for $200 in the most remote camps. Supply and demand operated without mercy. Ships arriving in San Francisco harbor were abandoned by their crews, who deserted to join the rush, leaving cargo to rot on the docks because no one would unload it for wages when gold waited in the hills. Men who had been comfortable farmers or clerks back east suddenly found themselves spending more on a week's food than they had earned in a month at home. The miners who survived were not necessarily the ones who found gold. They were the ones who figured out how to eat. Number 18, vinegar pie. Fresh fruit was a fantasy in the diggings. Apples, lemons, and berries either did not exist or cost more than a day's earnings. But miners craved sweetness the way drowning men crave air. Vinegar pie solved the problem with ingredients that every camp store carried. Vinegar, sugar, flour, water, and a bit of nutmeg combined into a filling that tasted remarkably like lemon custard once baked. The acidity of the vinegar tricked the palate into perceiving citrus, and the sugar smoothed the sharpness into something almost elegant. Miners who had not tasted fruit in months described vinegar pie with near religious gratitude. The recipe required no eggs, no milk, and no butter, all of which were either unavailable or priced beyond reason. A camp cook who could produce vinegar pie earned loyalty that lasted years. Number 17, dried beef stew. When fresh meat was unavailable, which was most of the time in remote claims, miners fell back on dried beef. Strips of jerked or salted beef were reconstituted in boiling water for hours, sometimes with potatoes or wild onions, if any could be found, until the meat softened enough to chew. The result was stringy, salty, and tough, even after hours of cooking. Miners in several documented camps complained so bitterly about the quality of dried beef that tensions escalated into actual confrontations with supply merchants who had charged premium prices for meat that was borderline inedible. The taste of improperly cured beef, rancid and metallic, showed up in so many trail accounts that it became a defining sensory memory of the gold rush. Yet dried beef kept men alive when nothing fresh was available for weeks, and that utility earned it a grudging place on every supply list. Number 16, Hangtown Fry. This is the most famous Gold Rush dish for a reason. Legend places its origin in Placerville, California, then known as Hangtown for its frequent vigilante justice. A miner who struck it rich walked into a hotel dining room and demanded the most expensive meal the kitchen could produce. The cook combined the three priciest ingredients available, fried oysters, eggs, and bacon, into a scramble that cost more than most men earned in a week. Oysters arrived in cans from the East Coast, or were hauled from San Francisco Bay, making them a rare luxury in the foothills. Eggs, when available at all, sold for $1 to $3 each. The combination was rich, briny, and absurdly indulgent. Hangtown Fry became the celebration meal of the gold rush, ordered by miners who had finally struck color and wanted the world to know it. Number 15, molasses on everything. Molasses was the sweetener that kept mining camps sane. Cheaper than sugar, more durable than honey, and available in heavy tin cans that survived rough transport, molasses appeared on flapjacks, in coffee, stirred into beans, poured over hardtack, and eaten straight from the can, by men who craved anything that was not salty or bland. A gallon cost between $1 and $3, depending on supply, and camps went through it fast. The thick, dark sweetness provided quick energy and made otherwise unbearable food tolerable. Miners who ran out of molasses before the next supply run described the loss with genuine despair. It was not just a sweetener, it was the only thing standing between a man and the full psychological weight of eating plain beans and hardtack for another month. Number 14, wild game stew. When a miner could hunt, and many could not because they lacked the time, skill, or ammunition, wild game transformed the camp kitchen. Deer, rabbit, quail, and occasionally elk were cleaned and simmered in a pot with whatever else was available: potatoes, wild onions, dried beans, or just water and salt. The flavor of fresh meat after weeks of salt pork and dried beef was almost overwhelming. Men described it in letters home with the kind of language usually reserved for reunions with loved ones. The stew simmered for hours, the tougher cuts breaking down into something tender and deeply flavored from the wild herbs and grasses the animals had grazed on. Not every camp had a hunter. The ones that did ate better, worked harder, and complained less. Fresh protein made a measurable difference in morale that no amount of beans could match. Number 13, canned oysters. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, canned oysters arrived in California by ship, packed in heavy tins that could survive months at sea. They were expensive, often $1 or more per tin. But for miners who had money and craved variety, canned oysters were a connection to the civilization they had left behind. Men ate them cold, straight from the tin, or fried them in bacon grease and served them over biscuits. The briny, metallic taste of tinned oysters bore little resemblance to fresh shellfish, but it did not matter. The act of eating something that was not beans, bread, or pork felt like luxury itself. San Francisco's oyster trade exploded during the gold rush, and the demand from mining camps drove prices higher with every shipment. Second pattern break. Here is what nobody talks about when they romanticize the gold rush: scurvy. Without fresh fruits and vegetables, miners developed vitamin C deficiency at alarming rates. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, old wounds reopening, and a deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. By 1850, scurvy was so common in the mining camps that it killed more men than mining accidents did. The foods on this list reflect that crisis. Every onion, every can of tomatoes, every scrap of wild greens was not just flavor. It was medicine. Men who understood this survived. Men who lived on nothing but salt pork, hardtack, and coffee deteriorated rapidly. The gold rush was not just a test of luck and endurance. It was a nutritional experiment conducted on hundreds of thousands of men who had no idea they were the subjects. Number 12, stewed dried apples. Dried apples traveled in burlap sacks and canvas bags across the plains and around the Horn. When a camp cook soaked those leathery brown rings in water and simmered them with sugar or molasses, they plumped into something that almost resembled fresh fruit. The aroma alone changed the atmosphere of a camp. Men who had eaten nothing but meat and starch for weeks would pause at the smell, something sweet and familiar drifting through the smoke and dust. Dried apples cost roughly 25 cents a pound in the camps, affordable enough that even modest outfits kept a supply. The stewed fruit appeared at the end of meals, a small act of civilization in a place that had very little of it. Number 11, beans and rice. When a miner had both, beans and rice combined into a meal that was more nutritionally complete than anything else in the camp pantry. The rice stretched the beans further, and the beans gave the rice substance. Together, they provided protein, carbohydrates, and enough calories to sustain a full day of labor. This combination showed up in camps where supply was relatively steady, usually within a day's ride of a trading post. The rice absorbed the flavor of whatever the beans were cooked in, whether that was bacon grease, salt pork broth, or just salted water. It was not exciting. It was not memorable. But it was balanced in a way that most Gold Rush meals were not, and the men who ate it regularly held up better than those surviving on pork and hardtack alone. Number 10. Bear meat. In the Sierra Nevada foothills, California grizzlies were still abundant in the early years of the rush. Miners who could bring one down, which was extraordinarily dangerous, fed their entire camp for days. Bear meat was dark, rich, and heavily flavored by the animal's diet of berries, acorns, and salmon. The fat rendered beautifully for cooking, and experienced camp cooks used every part of the animal. The meat was roasted on spits, stewed in pots, or fried in its own grease. A single bear could provide hundreds of pounds of food, but grizzlies fought back. Accounts from the 1850s describe miners mauled, treed, and killed in hunting attempts. The reward was enormous. The risk was real. By the 1870s, overhunting had nearly eliminated grizzlies from the gold country, and bear meat went from camp staple to distant memory. Number 9. Chili beans. Mexican and California miners brought chili peppers into the camps, and the introduction transformed the bland monotony of Anglo camp cooking. Dried chili peppers, ground or whole, simmered with beans and whatever meat was available, creating a dish with actual flavor, something most camp food desperately lacked. The heat of the peppers masked the taste of meat that was turning, preserved food slightly with its natural antimicrobial properties, and provided a warmth that went beyond temperature. American miners who had never tasted chili before became converts almost immediately. The recipe spread through the camps faster than news of a new strike. By the mid-1850s, chili beans were as common as salt pork in many diggings, a direct gift from the Mexican mining tradition that Anglo histories have largely failed to acknowledge. Number 8. Cornmeal mush. When the flour ran out and the last flapjack had been fried, cornmeal mush kept men alive. Cornmeal was boiled in water until it thickened into a dense, heavy porridge, served plain or with molasses if any remained. It was filling in the most basic, joyless sense of the word. No flavor beyond a faint grain sweetness. No texture beyond thick and smooth. Miners ate it because the alternative was nothing. Leftover mush that solidified overnight was sliced and fried in grease the next morning, producing something marginally more interesting that men called fried mush and ate without enthusiasm. The dish represented the absolute floor of Gold Rush cuisine, the meal that appeared when everything else had failed and the supply wagon was still days away. Number 7. Biscuits and gravy. When a camp cook had flour, lard, and baking soda, he could produce biscuits. Mixed quickly, shaped by hand, and baked in a Dutch oven buried in coals, the biscuits emerged golden and flaky, tasting more like hope than anything else in the camp. Split open and drowned in gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and water or coffee, they became a complete meal. The gravy stretched the fat further, coating each bite with richness that plain biscuits could not deliver on their own. Miners ate biscuits and gravy for every meal when supplies allowed it. The dish required no meat, no eggs, no milk, just flour, fat, and heat. A skilled cook who could time his biscuits right and produce a smooth gravy earned respect that no amount of gold could buy. Number 6. Rice and vegetables. Third pattern break. Here is something the history books skip over. The real money in the gold rush was not in mining. It was in feeding miners. Levi Strauss did not get rich panning for gold. He got rich selling supplies. Sam Brannan became California's first millionaire, not from a gold claim, but from a general store that sold shovels, pans, and food to men who had no other options. A merchant who hauled flour to a remote camp and sold it at 20 times the St. Louis price made more in a week than most miners made in a year. The economics of hunger were brutal and simple. Men who controlled the food supply controlled everything. Camp store owners set prices without competition, extended credit at crushing interest rates, and watched miners hand over their gold dust ounce by ounce just to keep eating. The gold rush was not a treasure hunt. It was an economy built on desperation, and food was the currency that mattered most. Chinese miners, who made up a significant portion of the gold rush population by the early 1850s, ate dramatically better than their Anglo counterparts. They carried rice, dried vegetables, dried mushrooms, soy sauce, and preserved fish into the camps. While American miners subsisted on salt pork and beans, Chinese miners produced meals with actual variety and nutritional balance. They stir-fried vegetables when fresh ones could be found, reconstituted dried ingredients with skill that bewildered other miners, and maintained a diet that prevented scurvy far more effectively than anything in the Anglo camp pantry. Their cooking was mocked and dismissed by prejudiced contemporaries. Modern nutritionists looking at the same diets call them remarkably sound. The Chinese miners, who were pushed to the worst claims and charged double taxes, outlasted and outworked their critics, in part because they simply ate better. Number 5. Canned goods. By the early 1850s, canned foods began arriving in California in significant quantities. Canned tomatoes, canned peaches, canned sardines, and canned condensed milk. The tin can revolutionized camp cooking overnight. Miners who had eaten nothing fresh in months could suddenly open a tin of tomatoes and taste something bright, acidic, and alive. Canned peaches became an almost sacred luxury, the sweet syrup drunk straight from the tin by men who closed their eyes and pretended they were somewhere else. The cans themselves were repurposed into cups, lanterns, storage containers, and building materials. Mining camps from the 1850s onward are identified archaeologically by the density of tin cans in the soil. Every can represented a small victory against the brutal limitations of frontier food supply. Number 4. Miners' stew. When a camp had any combination of potatoes, onions, meat, and water, miners' stew happened. It was not a recipe. It was an attitude. Everything available went into one pot and simmered until the toughest ingredient surrendered. Potatoes thickened the broth. Onions provided flavor. Whatever meat was available, salt pork, dried beef, fresh game, bacon scraps, gave it substance. The stew could cook for hours unattended, which mattered when every man in camp was working a claim and no one had time to stand over a fire. A single pot fed a group of partners and tasted different every time depending on what went in. That unpredictability was actually welcome. In a world of monotonous meals, a stew that tasted slightly different from last night's stew counted as variety. Number 3. Sourdough pancakes. The sourdough starter that produced bread also produced the best pancakes the mining camps ever tasted. A cup of active starter mixed with flour, a pinch of saleratus, and water or reconstituted milk powder created a batter which fried into tangy, bubbly cakes with a complexity that plain flour flapjacks could never match. The wild yeast gave them a slight, sour bite that cut through the richness of bacon grease and molasses. Sourdough pancakes were the reward for keeping your starter alive, and they were so beloved that the word sourdough itself became slang for an experienced miner, someone who had been in the camps long enough to maintain a living culture. Men who carried their starters across the plains and over the mountains earned a name from a pancake. That tells you exactly how much this food mattered. Number 2, Gold Rush chowder. In San Francisco and the coastal camps, miners combined canned or fresh clams, potatoes, salt pork, and whatever onions they could find into a thick, creamy stew that became the direct ancestor of the clam chowder we eat today. The dish arrived with New England miners who carried their foodways west and adapted them to whatever was available. The Pacific Coast provided abundant shellfish, and resourceful cooks stretched those clams with starchy potatoes and rendered pork fat into something that fed a crowd. The chowder was rich, briny, and deeply comforting in a way that nothing else in the camp kitchen could match. It tasted like the ocean and the farm at the same time, like home and adventure in the same bowl. What started as a desperate improvisation in the mining camps of 1849 became a defining American dish that San Francisco claims to this day. Number 1, sourdough bread. At the top of this list sits the food that defined the gold rush more completely than any gold nugget ever did. A living culture of wild yeast, flour, and water kept alive by human stubbornness and baked into crusty, tangy loaves over campfires from the Sacramento Valley to the Klondike. Sourdough bread was survival itself. It was the one food that a miner could produce from almost nothing as long as he kept his starter alive. That starter was science, tradition, and hope fermented into a single jar. Men who lost their starters to cold, contamination, or theft mourned them like lost companions. The bread it produced was dense, chewy, and sour in a way that no commercial bakery has ever quite duplicated because the wild yeasts of the Sierra foothills were unique to that place and time. Sourdough became so central to Gold Rush identity that the miners themselves became known as sourdoughs. Not prospectors, not 49ers, sourdoughs. They were named after their bread. No other food in American history has ever earned that distinction. The name said everything. You survived. You kept the culture alive. You fed yourself when the world gave you nothing but dirt and river water and the fading hope of fortune. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. The sourdough starter, the vinegar pie, the chili beans. Try cooking with nothing but what a miner would have had and see how far your creativity stretches when convenience disappears. Then come back and tell me which one surprised you. I want to know if the vinegar pie fools your taste buds the way it fooled theirs. I want to know if anyone has the nerve to try flapjacks on a flat rock. Because these were not just meals. They were the fuel that built California, one desperate, brilliant, forgotten plate at a time.